I am happy to have this opportunity, Perry Ann, just to introduce me. Having worked with Bob and Vince Cerf many years ago, it's very gratifying to me to see the interest in the chaining of the operations, the management of information at the sequence of bits, so that you can actually perform operations in different ways that you might find you couldn't do if you had to know and pass all the rights in what it is that is the underlying information. So it's a different perspective of how to approach the management, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Patrice. And next year we're going to have Patrice as our keynote, because I'm always an advocate for women in technology and in business. We all know she's the brains behind it.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Rozak, and I proudly serve as the chairman of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. I'm also co-founder of Block, enterprise software company in the blockchain ecosystem with my partner, Jeff Garzik. And it's an extraordinary honor to have Dr. Khan here today, the father of the internet. And I think it's really inspiring for all of us in this industry as we're building out the bridges, roads, and tunnels of blockchain to have this luminary here. And there's two things that were a takeaway for me. One was open networks, open systems. If you look at historically the internet, Linux, and now we're seeing more than a glimmer with projects like Bitcoin and Ethereum, really showing momentum on how the font of innovation typically glues itself to open networks. Part one. Part two, what was interesting is how Dr. Khan dissected blockchain between blocks and chains of data. And I think you bumped yourself near the top of the list of people that are probably Satoshi Nakamoto. So enjoy that. Up next, we have a video address from a very dear friend of mine that joins us from the European Parliament.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marietje Schaak and I'm a member of the European Parliament with the Dutch Democratic Party D66. We're part of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. And as we speak, there are elections in the Netherlands while you are gathering in Washington. So unfortunately, I cannot join you in person at the DC Blockchain Summit. But I'm glad that I can share some of my thoughts with you through this recording. In the European Parliament, I serve on the committees for Foreign Affairs, International Trade and Human Rights. I'm also the founder of the Digital Agenda Intergroup, which is similar to a caucus in the US system. We come together, cross-party and cross-nationality, and share an interest in digital technologies and in how they can benefit society. In this context, I organized the first hearing on the use of blockchain beyond the financial sector. It happened here in the European Parliament. And by bringing in experts, we examined possible regulatory approaches to different blockchain applications. The conclusion was that it is too early to call for strict regulations, but this assessment can, and I think it will, change over time. At the moment, not a day goes by without an event focused on blockchain in Brussels. Much of the discussion is still focusing on the benefits and threats from digital currencies like Bitcoin and the influence of technology on the future of the financial sector. While this is an important application of distributed ledgers, I like to focus on what blockchain can mean for our societies beyond its use as a virtual currency. How can the blockchain improve transparency of global supply chains and diminish the problem of conflict minerals, for example? How can the blockchain contribute to solving some aspects of Europe's migration crisis? According to blockchain believers, the technology can create a fairer, more sustainable world, which will empower ordinary citizens. The Bretton Woods II initiative, for instance, tries to achieve exactly this and wants to use blockchain technology to eliminate corruption and ensure fair elections. I applaud these efforts and believe we should dedicate EU funding to some of them in the future. While many claim that technology is neutral, I believe, in fact, all technologies incorporate values and politics, and it's important to be aware of them. Using distributed ledgers replaces trust in intermediaries with trust in encryption protocols, networking technologies, and peer-to-peer structures. In this context, to use this kind of blockchain is to participate in a wider shift that would reduce the trust or reliance on power of traditional institutions, such as banks or governments. So this makes it even more important to focus on the values going into the architecture of systems that we build. A blockchain takeover sounds exciting and promising to some, yet many of the expectations surrounding the promise of the blockchain remind me of the excitement about the future of the open internet itself. And although the internet has brought a lot of exciting, positive developments for the greater good, new technologies are certainly also used as an extension of government power or to amplify business models that do not have the public interest at heart. So in order to assess the true potential of blockchain technology, we will have to be aware of potential negative applications as well. What would, for example, be left of the empowering potential for the individual when blockchain is completely adopted and implemented by authoritarian regimes, when they use it to record and manage all assets or aspects of the identity of its inhabitants? I share these thoughts not to be a pessimist, but rather to encourage realism and perspective, and especially a focus on ethics in this discussion. I welcome initiatives such as the Blockchain Summit, and I hope regulators, technology developers, politicians find many other occasions for further dialogue on how blockchain can benefit society at large, can benefit the greater social good, and how we can prevent some of its potential negative consequences going further. I would very much welcome to discuss these topics in person with anyone who has ideas or follow-ups. I'll leave you with this for now, and I hope we can have more interaction in the future. I hope this provided some food for thought for the remainder of your conference. Thank you so much.
My name is Rosario Ingarjola, and I'm the CEO and founder of a company called OTC Exchange Network, or OTCXN, and a proud sponsor of this noteworthy event. We've developed a ground-up proprietary blockchain fabric that's for extremely high-performance permissioned ledger use cases. We're using this blockchain fabric ourselves to solve the biggest problems in the largest markets in the world. We're starting with the FX market, which some may know is a $5.1 trillion a day market. That's 50 times larger than all global stock exchanges combined. Our new market model solves the credit gap or market access problem that exists today. We basically give anybody that wishes access to wholesale FX pricing from the largest banks and non-bank market makers, but without the usual layers of cost and complexity. And the point of my telling you about this big, ambitious initiative at OTCXN is simply to say that we couldn't do it without blockchain. This incredible opportunity to re-engineer financial markets exists because of some of the realities that were so well articulated by our next keynote speaker, Mr. Alex Tapscott, in the international best-selling business book he co-authored called Blockchain Revolution, which has now been translated into 14 languages. It turns out there are many large-scale, deeply entrenched systems that can be re-engineered using blockchain. Mr. Tapscott is going to address one that is near and dear to the hearts of the DC community, namely government and democracy. But first, a little more about Mr. Alex Tapscott. Alex is a seasoned financial executive, entrepreneur, investor, and author. He's the CEO of Northwest Passage Ventures, an advisory firm and consultancy. Alex is also a founding member of the International Monetary Fund's Special Advisory Group on FinTech, as well as the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on Blockchain. He also sits on the advisory board of Elections Canada, the independent agency that runs elections and referendums in Canada. Previously, Alex was an executive at the investment bank Canaccord Genuity. Without further ado, it is my great privilege to introduce you to Mr. Alex Tapscott as he addresses Blockchain Revolution, Rebuilding Government and Democracy.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you all today because this is a pretty important time in our history, and not just because there is a radical new technology called blockchain that is quickly emerging to disrupt many aspects of business and government, but also because we are in the midst of a historic moment in the political world. That a new breed of politics, of populism, has basically executed a hostile takeover of the West, and we're seeing it emerge in many different parts of the world. Now, fundamentally, at the heart of this massive transformation, which has upended the status quo that we've enjoyed for the past 70 years, is a crisis of trust. Trust in our institutions and trust in government has been declining, basically unabated, for the past 50 years. And if anything, it's accelerated in the last 15 or 20. And this crisis of trust is metastasizing into something much worse, a crisis of legitimacy in many of our institutions. And as a result, we're looking for solutions in increasingly radical parts of the spectrum. So there's no silver bullet to fix our many social and political problems, but perhaps we could harness this powerful new technology to reinvent and rebuild democracy for a new era of trust and legitimacy. Fundamentally, I think there are three ways that can happen. The first is better, cheaper government, finally. The second is by restoring and renewing our democratic institutions. And the third one is by changing how we think about central banks and the financial services industry in our economy. So let's start with making government faster, better, cheaper. So I think this is something that we can kind of all agree on, regardless of what part of the political spectrum you're on. And it was something that was part of the political consensus about 25 years ago, actually, when this book, Reinventing Government, came out. Osborne and Gabler may be familiar to some of you. Basically, the thesis was we can bring the tonic of the market and new technology to bear on how we do government. And as a result, we can do more of it for less cost, provide greater services, and benefit all citizens. Now, for those of you who are in government or the direct beneficiaries of government services, I'd ask that you reflect, have a sober reflection on the past 25 years. Has government really transformed fundamentally because of technology, because of innovation? I think there are some examples that we can point to, but by and large, I think all we've really done is pave the cow path. We've taken things that we did on paper and we moved them online, but we haven't changed their underlying logic or their underlying architecture. Blockchain offers an opportunity to do that. So anyone with a cursory familiarity with the space knows about Estonia. Estonia, as a former satellite of the Soviet Union, in 1992 basically had a choice. They could build their new infrastructure, their new bureaucracy on old systems, or they could go digital. And that's what they did. And as a result, a country with GDP per capita that's about a quarter of what it is in the United States has been on the forefront, the bleeding edge of digital innovation, including in blockchain. They recently announced a couple of pilots that they're launching, one of which is with NASDAQ, to change the way that the stock exchange works. But this isn't something that applies just to small nations of 1.5 million people. We're increasingly seeing it take shape and take form in other parts of the world. So yesterday, Dubai made an announcement that IBM and Consensus Systems would be launching a blockchain city project. And they've set a very ambitious goal of moving all digital records and most government processes onto this kind of a system, everything from the procurement of taxes to the delivery of government services. You see examples of this in places like Georgia, unsurprisingly, another former Soviet satellite, and Sweden. So where's the United States at in all of this? Well, to be sure, there's a lot of innovation happening in this country. The private sector here has kickstarted growth and I think has helped to cause a spark that spread like wildfire to many different industries. But government, by and large, I think, is lagging the rest of the world. Now, the government here is decentralized, and you can't really talk about the government in the US without talking about different parts of it, agencies, state governments, et cetera. But I think more needs to be done. Illinois is a very good example. They put an RFI out recently for public blockchain services for everything from land titling all the way through to e-voting as a way to engage citizens. More of this needs to be done. But if we do this right, we can actually build government services that fulfill the promise of the technology revolution that we've been waiting for 25 years. And I think one of the key central components to this, as we've heard throughout the day, is the idea of digital identity. So a funny thing has happened over the past 25 years, which is there's been a creation of this whole new asset class called data. And data is as important to this economy as physical plant and equipment was in the industrial age or land was in the agrarian age. But the funny thing about this asset is that we create it, but we don't own it. It's owned by your bank, it's owned by social media companies, it's owned by governments. And that's problematic for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it prevents us from using that information to organize our affairs and also to not realize the value of that information, but also it could end up in the wrong hands, intentionally or not. It could end up being used against us, or it could be hacked and end up in the wrong hands. So I believe fundamentally that at the core of this second generation of the internet powered by blockchain is the idea of a sovereign identity, something that you alone control. And I think this concept can be applied to government, where the virtual you is also the virtual citizen. And you control information about many different aspects of your life. And when you interact with the government can trust that that information is accurate, that it's up to date, that it hasn't been forged, and that it is secure and private. Because you talk to people in government and they'll say, well, one of the reasons we worry about moving essential services online is because we're worried about data privacy and data security. I sit on the Elections Canada Advisory Board, you heard that in the introduction, and e-voting has been an idea that governments and Elections Canada has explored before, but for very good reason, they've chosen not to pursue it, because the internet, the first generation of the internet, was not well suited. Could this second generation provide the answer? So, previous technology revolutions, governments have not really been early adopters, but it seems as if this time it could be different. This was a study that was released a month and a half ago by IBM and the Economist Intelligence Unit that suggested by the end of next year, 14% of governments polled, so there's a little bit of selection bias, but 14% of governments that were polled would have blockchain implementations in production. So for those of you who represent different agencies in the government, maybe you're from the state or city level, reflect on where you're at. Are you going to be one of these leaders, or in 2 or 3 years' time, are you going to be in this latter group that hasn't done anything? The second big opportunity is to restore trust and legitimacy in our democratic institutions. This, perhaps even more than the first chart that I showed you, is the one that really scares me. So basically, this chart describes different age groups, people born in the 1930s through to the 1980s, and how much they feel they need to live in a democracy, how much they feel democracy is essential. And it turns out that it's been in precipitous decline. Now, I don't think that millennials are anti-democratic. I think they're looking at the institutions that represent them, their officials, and they're seeing they're maybe not working for them, that they're not beholden to their interests, they're beholden to other special interests, and that's creating another crisis of confidence. So what could we do to help restore faith in democratic institutions? One of the opportunities that's close to my heart, because of the work I do with the Canadian government, is e-voting. So as I described, e-voting has been sort of a holy grail concept for many years, but it's one that's been failed to implement in many parts of the world for very good reason, which is fundamentally the internet's not good for e-voting. For e-voting to work, you need to ensure that when a vote is cast, that it's counted for the person for whom you voted, that it is private, and that it can be audited after the fact. Now, if you're a government administering an election, you need all of those requirements, but you also need to make sure that when a vote is cast, that it can't be cast again. So we need a native digital medium for value that allows votes to be cast once and only once, and for them to be auditable and for the system to be trustworthy. So there's an interesting company called Votum, not the only one to be sure. There are dozens of companies that are exploring this concept, but one with a very interesting example of how they made this work. So the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, who's been? It's actually pretty cool, especially if you're an architecture buff, which might not be obvious because it's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but it's a cool building. So the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame did this challenge, or I shouldn't say challenge. They wanted to open up the voting to their fans a couple of years ago. And they basically allowed anybody to vote for which artist they thought should make it to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, there were a few groups on the list. One of them was the band Chicago. And it turns out that the band Chicago was very popular in the online poll. In fact, over the course of the voting, the band Chicago got 110 million votes. All the Chicago fans are like, why are you laughing? I love Chicago. It doesn't matter how much you love Chicago. I hate to break it to you. There are not 110 million Chicago fans in the United States or in the world or who have ever existed in the history of humanity. It's just not. If it was the Beatles, I don't know. But so this was hacked. So people were, using different IP addresses and creating false accounts and just voting in the band Chicago. And so it was kind of an embarrassment. So they brought this company, Votamin, to try and fix the way the system worked. And they implemented a blockchain voting system built on Tendermint, the Tendermint protocol, for those who are familiar with it. And they didn't get 110 million votes. They got like 1.5 million votes. And they had an audit trail that allowed them to see how people had voted and whether or not they were able to vote twice. And they're pretty confident that they were able to run this election pretty safely and securely. Now, that's good enough for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's obviously not good enough if you want to run the federal election. But for technology to work, you need to allow it to improve upon itself. So you have to start small. When Henry Ford developed the Model T, he didn't stop there, and neither did any of his competitors. So we need to test this stuff at where the stakes are low, and apologies to rock and roll fans, but the stakes are low, and then scale them up to where they can actually work. That's the only credible way we can make this happen. And if we do this right, I think we can get to a second era of democracy, one that's based on transparency, openness, but more importantly on engagement. Voter participation in the last election in the US dipped back to its long-term historical trend, which has been unambiguously down for 50 years. And this is something that's prevalent in every single democracy in the developed world. And if you don't have an informed electorate who is actively engaged in the democratic process, then you're going to see your institutions and your democracy erode. And the final thing is central banking. It's been 8.5 years since the financial crisis, but I think fundamentally that it still casts a very long shadow over all of our lives. And I think that part of the crisis of trust in our institutions started with a crisis of trust in many of our banks, who used to be held in higher regard, but since the crisis have taken a credibility hit. And this is something that plays out in many parts of the world. Now, the US has been recovering now for a long period of time, but in many parts of the world, they're still living like it's the fall of 2008. Youth unemployment in Spain, for example, is at 35%. So you're seeing structural unemployment that's leaving people outside of the economy and potentially alienated for the rest of their working lives. So again, blockchain's not a panacea, but there is this very specific way that we can help to improve the state of affairs. Who knows what this thing is? Yeah, so Rube Goldberg machine. Basically, it's like a really complicated apparatus that does a bunch of unnecessary steps, and in the end, it solves a very simple problem, like it closes a door or cracks an egg. This is basically the way the financial services industry works. Where you're trying to do something really simple, like you're trying to make a payment, move value from you to a merchant, or you're trying to, settle a transaction in a security, but it takes days to settle. It costs money, and it has to bounce through many different intermediaries. So we have a digital wallpaper that's made it seem like we're living in an automated digital world. You tap your card on the card reader at Starbucks, and maybe you think it's creating a digital payment, but of course it's not, right? So the underlying architecture is in need of improvement. And central banks know this. And actually, a revealing thing is Ben Bernanke, as early as 2013, quoted about Bitcoin that he thought it could hold long-term potential to reduce friction and cost in the financial system, and the upside of that to maybe make a more fair and inclusive market. And we're seeing central banks in many parts of the world stepping up. So during the time that the Brexit vote happened in the UK, and the Brexiteers were scurrying from the ship like rats, a very important paper was released by the Bank of England. It was called the Mansion House Speech. Has anyone read that? Yeah. So the Mansion House Speech was supposed to be a speech, but it actually didn't end up getting presented. It just came out as a paper. In that speech, the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, outlined a plan for the UK economy and said that there were two technologies that were going to have the biggest impact on the economy, more than any other factor, not just technology, any other thing. And he said it was fintech and blockchain, which is an important distinction, by the way. Blockchain is not a subset of fintech. Fintech is one area of technology innovation in an industry. Blockchain is much bigger, and it impacts many institutions. And he went so far as to say that maybe the solution would be to make a digital fiat currency. Essentially, not a Bitcoin in the case of the UK, but a Britcoin. So, yeah, okay. Every speech needs a dad joke. Anyway, so what are the benefits of something like this? Well, we could go into this in great detail, but I'm just going to cover some high-level points. The first is cost and efficiency. If transactions in marketplaces from financial assets to retail payments clear and settle in real time because you have a native digital medium that everyone uses and understands, then you're going to reduce the cost and friction of transactions. And the upside of that is going to mean a faster metabolism of the economy and more growth. So the Bank of England estimates by replacing 30% of transactions in the UK with a native digital currency, the GDP would increase by 3% permanently. So in a low-growth environment, especially in Europe, that's a lot. But there are bigger benefits. By using this technology, you can lower the barriers to entry for new participants, fintech innovators, and other third parties to come in and do cool stuff. And as a result, that competition will foster innovation, which will be borne by consumers. The costs that are passed through, the services that are created will benefit people, and that will help to lead to broader economic inclusion. We talk about financial inclusion, by the way, like it's a developing world problem. 2.5 billion people don't have access to banking. Do you know that 45 million Americans in the US don't have access to a bank account? So this is a problem not just for the global south, it's a problem for all of us. And then the third thing is by improving transparency, you can reduce risk, so concentrations of toxic assets can accumulate in certain institutions, creating systemic risk. You can also reduce the risk that people will question the legitimacy of these institutions, because if we can see in real time how money is flowing through the system, we can have greater trust that the bank is acting in the interest of the economy. And the final thing is it can allow central banks to do their job better. The Fed's been increasing interest rates recently. They say they want to do it a couple more times. Wait a little bit until they see signals of how the economy responds. Well, what if you could see how every single dollar was flowing through the economy, whether or not it was sapping investments, or whether or not it was dampening lending, or whether or not it was maybe having no effect? You could actually respond quicker and have better, more responsive monetary policy. So I'll end on this. There's a parable that originates from India about the invention of chess. So the inventor of chess is in the hall of the king, and the king is so grateful for this innovation that he offers him anything in the kingdom as a gift. And the inventor of chess says, well, all I really want is some rice to feed my family. But I want you to give it to me in this way. 1 grain on the first piece, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, etc. And the king is not a math guy. It's like, whatever. It'll be a big bag of rice, maybe a barrel of rice. Like, what a humble request from a humble man. But what he doesn't realize is 16 begets 32, 64. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the entire kingdom produces in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the entire planet in 6 feet of rice. So why do I bring this up? We are on the second half of the chessboard. When the first generation of the internet came along, there were 20-odd million personal computers, about as many connections to the ARPANET. Today, we've got an interconnected world where there are billions of internet-enabled devices in the hands of people spread across the world. So it's happening faster, and I think we're all seeing that. And if anything, it's only going to accelerate. So I ask that you embrace this technology and join the blockchain revolution. Plug for the book. Thanks a lot.